Good evening and welcome to Book Passage's Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. Whether you are joining us live or later in the recordings, we appreciate your viewership and your support. Speaking of support, please do take just a second to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's just a little quick thing for you, but it really helps us out a lot. Also, as a reminder, we will be taking your comments and your questions probably a little later in the program, but definitely as you think of it, put that in the chat and we'll get to it. I promise we will. Well, let's get started with tonight's very special event. Our featured book is considered a landmark work of untold American history. It kind of shows the reshaping of our understanding of identity, race, and belonging. And We Refuse to Forget, award-winning journalist Caleb Gayle tells the extraordinary story of the Creek Nation, a native tribe that 2 centuries ago both owned slaves and accepted Black people as full citizens. Creek leaders like Cow Tom, a Black Creek citizen who rose to become a chief, the US government recognized as a Creek citizen in 1866, I believe it was, for Black members. Yet this equality was shredded in the 70s. Why and how this happened is just a few questions that Caleb is going to get to that he explores in the book and we'll talk about tonight. Caleb Gayle is an award-winning journalist who writes about race and identity, a professor at Northeastern University and a visiting scholar at New York University. Gayle's his writings have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and many other publications. He joins us from Boston. And speaking of Boston, I'm so glad we're doing this tonight and not on Thursday night. Graciously agreeing to moderate the discussion is Caleb's conversation partner, award-winning writer Adam Harris. Adam is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he has covered education and national politics since 2018. He was previously a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. We so appreciate him taking on moderating duties. And with that, please welcome them to the Book Passage stage.
Thank you so much, Paula and Caleb. It's great to be with you this evening. Everyone, thank you for joining us, whether you're joining us now or watching later. I'm really excited to talk about your book. It is fantastic. Buy it, everyone. If you're reading, if you haven't picked it up, it is just a really brilliant exploration of identity, who we are, who we're told we are, and sort of what it takes to sort of reclaim that identity in yourself. But first, Caleb, I just kind of want to ask, we've talked about this before, but what inspired you to write this book? What were the sort of roots of the idea that became We Refuse to Forget?
Yeah. Thank you, Adam, and everyone else, folks over at Book Passage. This means so much to me. I can talk to you a little bit more about what it is that I put on the page. Look, I think that the reality is, I don't know if I was so much inspired to tell the story so much as I was haunted, right? As a very young kid, my family, Jamaican though they were, and from New York, decided for reasons that are beyond me and escape me still, to move to Oklahoma, of all places, and kids who looked like me, kids who had the same skin complexion, would look me dead in the eye and tell me, no, I got Indian in me. And while it might have sounded crass or different, it's a refrain that I think quite a few Black folks, especially those who didn't grow up in the Northeast, have heard quite a bit. And so like hearing that started to reshape kind of the narrow and fixed boundaries that I kind of put around how one could be Black in America, right? But of course, like while I was at The Guardian writing, I saw on the Tulsa World's website that Black people were suing the Creek Nation for citizenship. And it felt all of a sudden that those kids weren't really spreading myths or old wives' tales. They were actually speaking great power. They were wielding a history that was much stronger than I chose to recognize, than my schools chose to educate me on. And so it was then that I realized that I had to tell a story. I think also personally, I wanted an opportunity to help explain why it is that I felt as if belonging felt hard for those who didn't fit narrowly into boxes that none of us created or asked anyone to create. So that's what started this journey of wanting to explore this portion of American history that's too often forgotten.
Yeah, and actually speaking of sort of fitting narrowly into those boxes, I think very early in the book, there's a really interesting dichotomy and difference that you draw in between sort of how the Creeks had built the sort of the things that tied the Creek Nation together before the sort of government structure that was imposed by white supremacy. And once that structure came in, it sort of began the deterioration of that nation. Can you just talk about like that original idea of Creek nationhood, like what it meant to be in the Creek Nation?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to remember the kind of to remember and revere kind of the sovereignty and the creativity of those who were part of the Creek Nation, to kind of craft for themselves a sovereign nation that would operate unto itself, right? It wasn't necessarily on the terms that we would normally expect, right? Where ties could be made by matters of kinship, where various tribes could become federated and amalgamated within and create what we would now consider the Creek Nation in all parts of various portions of the southeastern United States. So to some extent, right, one, for instance, like me, right, let's say if I were a slave of a Creek Nation citizen, right, I didn't necessarily have to bear with me the scars of slavery, right? Once I was engrafted in, I was in, and unlike in the United States, right, where our governance structure kind of narrowly identified people as only one thing, right? Oftentimes things that would redound to the benefit of white landed men and not pretty much anyone else, right? I could be nothing else but a slave. I could not be nothing else than the son of a slave, and my kids and my kids' kids and my kids' kids' kids would only be considered slaves. Whereas in the Creek Nation, you lost the vestiges of that slavery identity that so narrowly kind of fixed you within parameters that quite frankly didn't really speak to the splendor and the beautiful complexity that we all kind of contain. So the nature of citizenship construed and constructed within a much more creative, in my opinion, sovereign nation that was the Creek Nation, that is the Muscogee Creek Nation, it allowed and engendered a certain level of kind of accommodation for all that people were, as opposed to the winnowing down to the very minute details that were easy to convey that we would normally see in the United States government.
Yeah. And so along those lines, Paula at the beginning kind of mentioned one character who sort of carries throughout the book. A character who I've just sort of become fascinated by as I was reading the book is Cow Tom. Can you tell us who Cow Tom was?
Yeah. Without giving the whole.
Yeah, without. I don't want to give away the whole book, but just tell me like the fundamentals of who Cow Tom was and how he explains that sort of this idea that you could be Black and Creek.
Yeah. So the best way to kind of explain who Cow Tom is to see him through the eyes of someone who didn't respect him for all that he could be, right? So there's a guy named Ethan Allen Hitchcock who clearly took his name, his namesake was Ethan Allen, one of the founding fathers of this country. And he was on a mission throughout what was then called Indian Territory, which we would now consider Oklahoma. And he was interviewing a variety of members of the Muscogee Creek Nation. And one of the folks that he interacted with was a guy named Cow Tom, but he didn't call him by his full name. He said his Negro, referring to the Creek chief for whom Cow Tom worked, and said, oh yeah, his Negro Tom, almost implying very clearly that this guy was the slave of Cat Yardley, right? When in actuality, there's nothing to prove that he ever was, right? And so he captures in this interaction with Cow Tom, who is a Black man, clearly a Black man. His oral history tradition goes that he was a man with jet black skin, so he and I could identify with that. Anyways, at any rate, he talked about with this Hitchcock fellow, how much he wanted a grist mill, a school for his children, land, right? He kind of talked about the aspirations that he had. And perhaps because Hitchcock didn't fully understand who this person who was fully Creek, right? And also fully Black at the same time, he recorded his dreams as kind of that, right? These elusive pipe dreams that one may or may not be able to actually attain. But in actuality, Cal Tom was so much more, right? He became not only one of the chief interpreters for the nation, he then became chief during one of the worst moments in this country's history during the Civil War. And he, on top of that, was sent on behalf of the Creek Nation to negotiate peace treaties, one in particular that included the emancipation of all Black people. And not just that, not just the emancipation of all Black people, but then also the provision of full citizenship rights within the Creek Nation. So a guarantee with emancipation that Black people weren't getting elsewhere in the United States, right? And it allowed them again to fully occupy their Blackness whilst also fully occupying their Creekness. And for a lot of us today, right, we find ourselves kind of our voices, the diversity of our voices that we contain within us kind of mollified because we're told you can only be one thing, right? You can only be this or part this and part that to make yourself whole, when in actuality, we contain oftentimes multitudes.
Yeah, yeah. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I also want to talk about the writing process. Because, you know, having written a book, you know, just thinking about how you sort of have the topic, you have like where do you start with your research and with sort of digging into a topic that is this vast, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think honestly, when I first kind of started thinking about this being a book, I thought it was going to be kind of a legal drama, if you will, right? Because a lot of liberation and emancipation of people within this country has been litigated, not just legislated, right? And so I thought for sure that that's where a lot of this was going to be. And so I started with the folks who were suing the Creek Nation back in 2018 for citizenship, and also with the court records of people who sued in the early aughts, and on and on and on, and kind of kept on tracing it backwards. But what I realized is that the references that people were making were so much more deep than, or so much deeper than strictly a question of legal back and forth, right? That there was something far more here, that they were making a fact-based claim, and I needed to better understand the facts. And then in understanding those facts, I need to understand the context. So I found myself most times kind of spinning out of control, right? I thought I had, you know, a pretty tight legal drama set. It was going to be great. It was going to be great. It was going to be biting, you know, cliffhangers on closing statements. That's what I thought I was going to be doing, when in actuality, that would be only a surface treatment. That it would almost be a symptomatic approach. And what I wanted to get was where did we go wrong in this story? How did we go from such a creative and imaginative way of approaching identity into one that was so limited and flattening, right? And so in terms of the research part of the writing process, it started talking to folks, but then it also required reading how people talked about and describe these curious characters, right? It was in hearing some of the first folks who were working as statisticians in the Department of Labor, identifying that, oh, these Black Creeks, these people in the eastern portion of Oklahoma are the best hope for Black people in America, right? It was reading the Muskogee Scimitar and these old Black newspapers and sometimes white newspapers to hear about the successes that were occurring there. It was even identifying letters from various people advertising the great opportunity one could find in Oklahoma that, quite frankly, I didn't see growing up, right? And so I think to some great extent, that spinning out of control really created the opportunity for me to really paint a much broader picture of what it looks like for people who were recently, you know, either people who were recently emancipated or those who had never been enslaved. It was interesting getting the opportunity to be part of their imagination, to be part of the world that they were building. And I wanted to give the readers the opportunity to tap into that.
Yeah. Was there, in your research, was there one document, one thing that really just sort of took you aback, that sort of surprised you and made you, kind of stopped you in your tracks?
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm always surprised. I don't know why. I'm always surprised with like the unmitigated gall of people who are racist. There was an article that was written, I can't remember if it was the Fort Worth Telegraph or something like that. I might be misquoting, but I know it was a paper out of Fort Worth. They were kind of admiring what was going on in the eastern portion of Oklahoma or Indian Territory, for that matter, kind of seeing the successes of Black people within the Creek Nation, people that would even call Negro Creek, right? They were using language that was even more imaginative, and they were kind of spelling doom to come for these folks as Oklahoma reached its statehood, and they said the day of the Negro Creek is in fact done, right? I think that's how I end one of the chapters, right? And is like the almost pleasure they took in spelling the end of what they thought was an imaginative and interesting way of existing. I think the other one is the quote from Henry Dawes, who I'm sure we'll probably talk about, probably one of the most dastardly people who we would probably, for some portions of American history, admire, right? Whose mission it was supposedly to befriend, as he would put it, the Indian, right? But his whole purpose, right, was to ensure, he even said at one point in a conference at Lake Mohawk and in front of all of these other elite white Northeasterners who maybe not unlike people today would be probably priding themselves, patting themselves on the back about how progressive and interesting they are. And he said, I want to quote this, he says, "The work is accomplished when the Indian has become one of us." Right? When he could strip away all of the things that made people the way they are, such that they would become indistinguishable from us, right? That was kind of the end state that would be ideal, such that people were becoming more white, right? So I think like the unmitigated gall of some of these heroes or leaders, people that were entrusted with doing so much, not just to those who were here first, but also for the entire country, saying things that, quite frankly, were alarming, but also gave me at least so much insight into the politics and the culture of that time.
Yeah. In the context of today, right, and this sort of battles over the history that is being remembered,
Sure.
you talked about the way that we sort of lionize some of these individuals, we lionize folks, and present effectively a sort of sanitized, this is all the good that this person did. Like, we can't criticize this person too much because they did some good. So there are going to be two parts to this question. One, can you just give me give us the Cliff Notes version of who Dawes was, and then sort of throughout the book, you sort of remember these folks who are ostensibly and largely, right, they did do good things. Some of them did do good things, but they also had this side that was racist, or they had this side that was, this is a purportedly good thing, but it doesn't take into account the wants and the wishes of the people who are actually within the nation.
Yeah.
Can you just sort of talk about that sort of idea?
Sure. I mean, so Cliff Notes version of Henry Dawes, aside from the fact that he was a senator from the state in which I live, Massachusetts, he was also someone who prided himself on being very anti-slavery. And you have to understand, he was kind of coming out of the shadow of the Civil War. The Union has won. They're trying to consolidate power. They're trying to think about, what does progress look like in America? How do we do that? But Henry Dawes, fundamentally, at the end of the day, if we're looking from an outcomes approach, was like one of the worst racists we've ever had, right? One of the most anti-Indigenous human beings we've ever had, especially someone with that much power. But effectively, one of his signature things that he did was pass the Dawes Act, which then created the Dawes Commission, which allowed the United States government, even though the people who had been banished from the southeastern United States to what is now Oklahoma were promised that they would be left alone, Henry Dawes wanted to make sure that he quickly assimilated all of these Native Americans, and that meant oftentimes breaking up communal lands and making them privatized. But who are you going to give that land to? Well, you're going to give it to people who you, Henry Dawes, deem are Creek enough, right? Or who aren't too Black to also be considered Creek. And so oftentimes he would spend his time, or at least spend the time of the folks who worked for the Dawes Commission, really kind of narrowly construing who could be what, and then dividing folks into different roles, different citizenship roles, some who were Creek freedmen, right? Which fast forward almost 100 years, kind of lost anyone's ability who was on the Creek freedman role to be considered a citizen today within the Creek Nation. And then also those who were by blood or full blood in some sense. And that was often done not just through, shoddy genealogical records, definitely not through DNA, not through some real blood test, right? But rather oftentimes through eyeballing people. So that's Henry Dawes. And to your second question, like, how do we remember people like that? I think we talk in not so much with the hope of balancing this, but rather in a forthright way saying, look, here are the accomplishments of this person. Oftentimes, as you mentioned, accomplished without the consent or interest or desire of those people we're trying to supposedly help. But here are the accomplishments, but also here's a laundry list of painful things. One of the people I talk about in the book is George Washington, right? Who is known as Town Destroyer, right? Because he spent a good deal of his time trying to civilize people, right? Considering Native Americans savage, but then also trying to do the things that would provide them civilization in his mind, which really just meant, how do we make these people as white as humanly possible, right? And so that's kind of the contention. I don't think history is supposed to be as linear or as easily acceptable as possible, right? And I think perhaps we would do well to remember the full extent of people, because then we don't strip away people's humanity, right? And I think that's the critical thing. We all have, in some cases, fallen short, and we've all done things that are pretty terrible in some form or another. We've thought things that are terrible. We've done things that aren't well. And so as such, we don't want to strip away the opportunity for people to be fully human. And I think the better consideration of history allows us to do just that.
Yeah. Something, before reading the book, something I actually don't think I fully appreciated, and it's about halfway through, about sort of the anti-miscegenation laws, was how they sort of made distinctions between, between races, right? It's effectively to make distinctions between races. Black people can't marry white people can't marry black people, but within that like non-binary structure, it's like, you write that black people couldn't marry natives, but whites could. And can you talk about how that was, in effect, a way to deal with people who had been successful, like Black Creeks who had been successful in Oklahoma and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, look, if your goal, if we're doing this under the auspices that Henry Dawes had kind of stipulated, right? The goal of kind of making it such that, as he said, the Indians, and that there's no real distinction between, as he would put it, the Indians and us, the white people, right? The kind of growing number at that time, the growing proportion of people within Oklahoma whose complexions were a little different, whose histories were intermixed with a variety of different types of people, namely Black people, right? That's always seen as a threat. And I think the history of anti-miscegenation and anti-miscegenation laws kind of speak to that, right? It's kind of the same story over and over again. So to some extent, right, the laws that were passed in Oklahoma to try and prevent that was really for the hopes of ensuring, in many cases, in a more sinister and more cynical sense, right, to ensure that white people were able to then engraft themselves even further into the vast expanse of the unknown opportunity that was Indian territory becoming Oklahoma, and to essentially kind of wall off Black people from doing the same, right? And so the almost nuanced nature of those anti-miscegenation laws really kind of carried that effect even further.
Yeah. Was there, of course, inevitably when you're in the process of writing a book, right, you submit a chapter, you submit 2 chapters, or you submit the whole thing. Your editor looks at it, he's like, oh, well, this is fantastic. I think we're going to get rid of this little part right here. We're going to get rid of this little part right here. Was there a story that was left out of the book that that either you might have wanted to include, or that there might not have been space to include, or a natural place for it? Was there a story or a fact that you that really just caught your attention that you might have wanted to share?
Yeah, so two really quick ones. I talk about him in brief, which is Dennis Cooley, who I found to be probably the most interesting character. This guy who essentially was deputized to be kind of the convener in chief, especially in the wake or in the aftermath of the Civil War, as the United States government was actively trying to structure deals that oftentimes were punitive to a lot of these Native American nations, but also ensured emancipation for a lot of the Black people who were held as slaves in some of these nations. There was not, well, you can't just say there's only one guy doing it, but this guy kept on popping up in all of my research as a person who was constantly convening these parties. And I always found him fascinating, in part because the ways in which he was remembered by those who were being asked to meet with the US government was such that, like, he wasn't necessarily presenting a true choice, right? It was like, either you come or you deal with the might and power of this US government, right? So I always found him just fascinating and interesting. I'm sure there's more inquiry to be extended into who he was and who he is. I think to the other thing is, like, quite a bit of what I do in the book is include memoir, right, as a means of making some of this history even more accessible for the reader. And there's like one particular moment that I can never forget that we just didn't get into the book this time around, that essentially demonstrated how we misremember history and perhaps how we bastardize it, even in places where you wouldn't expect. So when we moved to Oklahoma and I was in an elementary school, we quite literally, I had no idea what was going on because we had just come from New York. We knew nothing of Oklahoma history. All the kids were given wagons in the first grade. We were sent out to a field and we simulated the Oklahoma land run, right? In which you know, that harkens back. So for that class, for all those fourth graders, hundreds of fourth graders in that school, we were memorializing one of the most harmful acts in history. And we were almost making light of it, trivializing it, honoring it to some extent. And so I think, like, that, perhaps, I mean, we weren't having discussions when I was writing the book on CRT and what textbooks can or cannot include, but perhaps even for this next, for the paperback edition, maybe we will include that because it demonstrates what harm we can do when, even on the land that was once both the Cherokee and the Creek, we were actually simulating the land run. So I think that's one that isn't in there now that might perhaps be in there for another edition later on.
Yeah. And for the audience, we're going to start bringing in your questions here in a little bit. Caleb, I have a couple more for you before we do that. And one of them, you talk about how you employ memoir kind of throughout the book. And for a book about identity, can you talk about why it was so important to, include that memoir, right? As you're writing about identity, as you're writing about, who we are, who people have told us we are, who we believe ourselves to be. Can you just talk about why it was so important to include that memoir in this sort of book about identity?
Yeah, I think that I don't know if I really wanted to include much by the way of memoir, right? Initially, right? Again, it's going to be a legal drama. We're going to call it a day. But I think to some extent, I realized that a lot of this history, which has been obscured, right? Oftentimes, the best way to kind of get people bought in is by helping them by becoming more vulnerable. I think a lot of what I do in the memoirs admit just how little I knew growing up, right? And if I, a kid who grew up in Oklahoma, did not know any of this history, not a little bit, not all of it, no, just none of this history, perhaps this gives us the opportunity to do the same, right? Perhaps this gives us the opportunity to let down our guards, provide ourselves the grace to start our learning journeys about what this country has been and how it fashions identity. And so perhaps part of the reason I did it was primarily to give the reader kind of all the permission in the world to admit what we don't know, as the launching pad for discovering so much more.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk about like how wealth is built and maintained, right? And in some ways, the early 20th century for Black Creeks, late 18th century or 19th century for Black Creeks, sort of presents an alternate reality for a world, with reparations. And so how has working on this book and studying Black Creeks made you think differently about progress, what progress requires, especially when people have been held back, and reparation?
Yeah. So I think like all this work does is demonstrate to me that there's so much more to do so that people can become confronted with the truth in ways that are vivid and well told, right? So I think like I think I even admit in the book that it was hard for me as a kid to really grapple with and accept reparations as the policy path forward, because quite frankly, I wasn't told the whole truth, right? So like what exactly am I paying for? Right? What exactly are we as a country saying that we owe if we don't actually figure out what has been lost, right? What has the injury actually been? What would we need to repair if I don't actually know what's been broken, right? And so for me, I think that being able to tell the story end to end of a family representative of so many others that had some of the highest of highs and perhaps the lowest of lows by not being members of those nations now, really I think demonstrates like the depths of what is lost by not knowing any of this history. So I think hopefully confronting the truth of what has happened perhaps provides the appropriate context for us to have really informed conversations about what reparations can be, and also doing so hopefully with well written material can do so in a way that perhaps very lengthy policy proposals cannot, right? In a way that really complicated legislation, backroom deals, or complex city ordinances that we maybe see in Asheville or Evanston and others might not do, right? So I think hopefully I'm just one of many who are adding to the course, such as yourself with your book, right? Adding to a chorus of people who are trying to provide the pathway for people to understand what the truth actually has been, what the truth actually is.
And I want to wrap in one audience question because it actually dovetails with one that I had. Linda asked, can you explain the current controversy of certain Native tribes not accepting or recognizing Blacks in their tribes? In the book, you explain the sort of ways that has happened, but can you just sort of explain just a piece of that, right? The Cliff Notes version of what the kind of current position is
Sure.
of Native tribes and their Black citizens.
Sure. Yeah. I think one, so there, I mean, it's diverse, right? So when you look at, for instance, the Cherokee Nation, right? Similar to what the Creek Nation has experienced, the Cherokee Nation was sued by, or taken to court by Cherokee freedmen, Black former, descendants of Black people who were once citizens of the Cherokee Nation, and they lost. The Cherokee Nation lost to some Cherokee freedmen. A similar thing happened in the early aughts with the Seminole Nation. And so there have been examples of some of this restoration. And of course, like it doesn't necessarily mean that all is free and clear and easy, but it means that there's a pathway. There's some reason for hope, in part because a lot of these other nations also included clauses very akin to what we would see with the Creek Nation in their treaty of 1866 that entitled people to not just emancipation, but also citizenship, right? And so for the Creek Nation, yeah, they have not, right? And they've been somewhat resistant to do so. I don't know what the future holds necessarily for the descendants of Black Creeks today, right? I think a lot of it is both A, trying to educate people that this history even exists, right? A, right? And then B, is it a policy remedy? Is it a legal remedy? And so I think what will end up being the case is still to be seen. And I don't think people like Marilyn Vann or Kenneth Cooper or people like that who were Black Cherokees expected to win in the way that they did, but they did, right? And so perhaps I think for a lot of the descendants of Black Creek folk, like there's a reason to at least at bare minimum have hope.
Yeah. And you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but can you dig a little bit more? We have a question from the audience that asks, what did slavery look like for the Creek Nation tribe, especially compared to white America's chattel slavery?
Yeah, so I think the use of chattel slavery is really important, right? So I think one, like the diversity of type is important that you would see within the Creek Nation, right? I mean, the reality is that there was, especially initially and for quite some time, a strong aversion to the practice of slavery, especially the way in which it was practiced by white people in the United States. So as I mentioned earlier, right, one could be even considered a slave, but be practicing perhaps, what we would see also in West Africa, like kinship slavery, where one could be working on the land, but also break bread with folks, be considered their equal, but be it also in their service. But also the most important thing is that the mark of slavery just didn't stay on you, right? It wasn't permanent, right? And that legacy, that history goes back to the Coosa tribe, which were members, it was a member tribe of the Creek Nation that also rebuffed the notion of slavery, or at least rebuffed the mark of it once people were accepted into the nation. So I think it's really important to remember that like all slavery, no, slavery is good for sure as a base minimum, but to the person's question, that nuance, that difference is, I think, also equally important to understand, especially the Creek Nation's reticence to accept such a practice in any of its forms.
Yeah. And so the book, right, it talks about the sort of, Black Creeks, Black Cherokees, Black Seminoles, right? They are in the position of trying to, wrest back their identity, trying to wrest back their membership from another group that has been subjugated, right? From another group that has been marginalized, that they are, that they have lineage in. Can you just talk a little bit about, because one of the questions is asked, have you gotten positive feedback on the book from Native writers or tribe leaders? And within that question, I also want to ask, just thinking about that Black Creeks, Black Seminoles, Black Cherokees are fighting to reclaim their identity from a group that has been marginalized, that has been subjugated, and the difficulty of that for those people who are fighting for their rights from that tribe.
Yeah. I mean, it's something different to be on the margins of margins, right? Like you're twice marginalized, if you will. So I think like the reality is it's important first to understand that these are sovereign nations, right? That have laws and rules and regulations like any other sovereign nation. And I think the claim that, one of the claims that one of the people in the book makes is that, look, we completely understand the wariness and the struggle that comes with being told who can be here and who cannot, right? But in their estimation, this person's estimation, look, you must follow the law that you even have, right? And I think that was the contention for people like Marilyn Vann and others in other nations who have been successful in their desire to regain that citizenship. So I think, like, to some extent, put simply, it is a deeply uncomfortable conversation to have. It's an incredibly uncomfortable book or endeavor to wade into this topic, in part because you're dealing with people on both sides who have been split and also marginalized by white supremacy, not so much by each other, right? That really it's okay to admit that oftentimes, again, if we're going to respect the full humanity of people, right, we have to be okay with the fact that in some instances, these sorts of conflictual relationships and interactions develop, right? It's the question of, are we going to allow some of those conflictual things to calcify such that we don't lead to progress, or we don't move towards progress, or are we not? And I think for a lot of the folks who are involved in this work, right, they just kind of they feel as if there needs not be a scarcity that we apply to identity, right? That oftentimes in America we apply, or at least in the West, we apply scarcity to a lot of things. Must it also be identity, right? Is not our history for these folks like plenteous enough for us all to share in, especially if we can trace very meticulously our history to this nation, right? So I think that oftentimes we're put in a position, I think often by kind of the backdrop of white supremacy, to consider that all identity is scarce. All things are scarce, when in actuality, they don't necessarily have to be.
Yeah. And it's impossible to sort of, dictate what people think kind of coming out of a book, but what do you hope, one or two things that you hope people get from reading this book?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that people get that identity can be scaffolded on an ongoing basis by a host of different things, right? And they shouldn't necessarily be dictated by individuals you didn't ask to dictate dictate them to, right? I think like the reality is that I think that this book hopefully does the work of giving us the opportunity to recognize a story that oftentimes we will not find in our textbooks. B, gives us the opportunity to rethink how we construct identity. And I think C, hopefully gives people the opportunity to now be more gracious to one another about what it is that we don't know, realizing that perhaps we're all on a continuous journey of learning, better understanding and appreciating the history that shapes us. And I think if those three things could happen, I know I'm asking for a lot. You asked for one, I asked for three things. But if any one of those things could happen, if all three of those things could happen, I'd be overjoyed.
Yeah, asking you shall receive, So we have a question. You mentioned that the book started out as a legal drama, but involved into a mix of the history and the memoir. They asked, do you still have the legal drama in you or in the book?
No, I'm going to leave that to people like Patrick Radden Keefe, talking about, empires of pain and all that jazz. I'm going to leave that to him, rogues and all that stuff. I'm going to leave that legal drama to people like him. I think that I think the only way in which a legal drama is still in me is if that legal drama could more aptly help me articulate some of these large questions of identity and could help me excavate history that we otherwise wouldn't know. I think if the legal drama provides the opportunity to do so, if that's the useful vehicle, then you bet I have a legal drama. But as of now, no, I'm gonna leave that to folks who make legal dramas their living.
And actually, to that point, can you talk about what sort of, without giving too much away, about the next books, the next projects? What's next?
Yeah, so I'm already hard at work on the next book. One of the characters you'll see in this book, his name is Edward P. McCabe, and the title is tentatively called Push Ahead, which was the name given to him for being a bit too insistent on wanting, above all things, the desire to colonize Indian territory for Black people. As controversial as that is, as problematic as that is, both his rise to power from New York as a person on Wall Street to Chicago working with Parker Palmer and the Cook County administrative office to running the state budget of Kansas as the first Black statewide elected official in the Old West. His decision to instead harness all the ambition under the sun that he could muster to, in fact, try to colonize Indian territory and make it an all-Black state, which was a desire of not just Edward McCabe, but of many others who had plotted this desire to create a Black Oklahoma. So that's the next story. And apparently, if you read closely, eventually you'll notice that his legacy lives on in institutions like Langston University, or even in the 50 Black towns that were established in Oklahoma, of all places. So really excited to dig into that one as well.
Yeah. And so actually, if an audience, if you have any more questions, please feel free to submit them. I actually just have one more that it actually harkens back to something that you said a little bit ago about the sort of idea of scarcity, and the idea of scarcity and America and the West, and how they sort of cultivated this idea of, this sort of zero sum idea, right? If you get something, then I'm not going to get it, and there's not enough for all of us. But at the beginning, we were talking about how the Creek Nation had built a sort of identity around, like a sort of communal identity, right? It was, everyone was growing crops for everyone, or if you were tending to to these crops and this person was sick, then they would tend to your crops for them. What are some of the things through your research, through writing this book, that just really made you think, man, I wish we could like bring that into now?
Yeah. I mean, so many things, whether it's, the amount of money Kyle Tom left his family, right? Comparison to the, what, $8 in net worth that the average Black family is it Massachusetts has, or, the degree to which I think, like, one thing that I would love, even personally from a selfish perspective, right, is the carrying on of oral history traditions, right? I think like it was so motivating, so powerful, so moving to sit with people of all backgrounds and be able to hear about how meticulously they've tended to their family stories, right? How they've been the trustees of their dreams to some great extent, and how much I have been lacking with my own family, right? And keeping these oral history traditions alive, right? The notion of my grandparents coming to the States and what sort of things they experienced, or my grandmother organizing an SEIU 1199, and what that must have been like for someone who at the time couldn't even read. So I think those oral history traditions provide such a great degree of power, and also helps to fuel people's identity. So I wish I could bring that back, right? And so I think those were some of the things that I wish. I also think the main thing is I just wish there was more. I think I grew up with, beyond, my parents or, family, I didn't have many Black heroes, right? I didn't go to a school where we even celebrated Black History Month. We oftentimes didn't even recognize Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I mean, just the extent of it. And I know that if I'm experiencing that, there are plenty of other kids around the country who are. And so maybe not so much what I learned in the book. I wish that these sorts of concepts were not so novel. I wish that this stuff was old hat. I wish this stuff was as common as anything else, right? And I think perhaps including some of that might provide a greater landscape of heroes and heroines for young kids. I just wish that I had that. I salivated for that and never got satiated until I was so much older. And so that's one thing I wish I could bring back as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, in that, just thinking about making that history more readily available, making it common, right? In this kind of current context of, people intentionally trying to forget these sticky parts of American history, of course it's hard to like do a prescriptive thing, but how can educators, right? How can folks who are working in schools, working with kids, begin to do some of that work and making the curriculums more holistic, more real and reflective of American history?
Yes, I mean, I think one, there are so many teachers who are giving students so much more than perhaps their textbooks are giving them. There are so many teachers who are endeavoring to create worlds with their students that have existed before or that have been dreamt before. But I think we as writers, right, I think this is where we kind of play a greater role, right, in trying to find ways to write for all age groups continuously. I mean, there are plenty of people already doing it, but to do it with even greater force, right, greater vigor, greater volume, such that it becomes easily accessible, such that it almost feels more like an ecosystem, an echo chamber, if you will, of information that we otherwise wouldn't get, being pumped out into the ether, such that more kids independent of their teachers, teachers independent of their kids, teachers in partnership with families and administrations and school districts have the opportunity to access information, oftentimes, I think, through stories and storytelling, right? And so I'm not necessarily certain of how that'll all happen, right? But I do think that there's work to be done that involves a much more communal approach, that doesn't necessarily isolate teachers into doing it on their own because they're already overworked, overstretched, and underpaid, right? So I think perhaps it's our collective work to do that continuously.
Yeah. There's a question from the audience. It says, of late, we hear sometimes how Natives feel positively or negatively about Blacks claiming their Native identity. But is there much out there about how the Black community feels about Blacks partially identifying as Native? And of course, you do some of this work in your book as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the first answer is check out the book, but the second answer is also, I think that, when we moved, so when we didn't realize how common it was for people to have a very similar refrain, right? And so I think to some extent, in Oklahoma, we have a tendency of believing people when they say that, right? But then also I think that, like, I don't know, I never want to say that the Black community feels this way, right? I never want to provide such a broad diagnosis of what might be happening in an entire community. But I do think that, like, sometimes, right, we claim these identities, we claim other identities of all sorts to be more proximate to power, or what we might perceive to be proximate to power, proximate to whiteness, proximate also to certain struggles that might provide for us a greater idea of who we are. I mean, when we look back at people even like Toni Morrison, who wrote Paradise, along with many other books, about the ways in which we kind of dreamed, right? There's tons of African-American literature from this time period, which I'm writing, in which they were, exploring what it might look like to be in close comity and relationship with their Native counterparts, what it meant to be in association with them, how there might be a paradise that might exist beyond what they might see in certain parts of the Deep South. So that tradition has always been there. How the Black community as a whole feels about it, I couldn't tell you. But how have members of the Black community throughout history imagined it? I mean, in so many interesting, really powerful ways of all sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Caleb, I want to thank you so much for your time and for chatting with me. If you have not yet, please pick this book up. It is fantastic. And Paula, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Adam, and you too, Caleb. Excellent conversation. I think at the beginning, I may have done a disservice because I just said the main title. And I think it's important, that subtitle is really, really important. We refuse to forget: a true story of Black Creeks, American identity and power. And it really does sum it up. Come for the title and the cover, but you'll stay for the information. And I'm so glad, Caleb, that you did kind of incorporate memoir with history, because something about that makes it read more than just kind of a very academic type book. It makes it a little bit more accessible and engaging, because we want to know more about you and your personal history, but we also get the backdrop of this greater search for identity. So thank you for that. Thank you for your talent.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
it with us. Yeah. Yeah. Just to remind folks, I don't know, we may be getting book plates. Are we getting book plates, Caleb? Is it
I
possible?
believe so.
Yep. So we do have first edition copies of this book, and you heard it from the author himself. We are also getting book plates. So definitely come by the stores, San Francisco, Corte Madera. Feel free to come in safely and purchase book or multiple books, order online. call on the phone. We have eager booksellers that would love to tell you more about Caleb's book as well as others. Thank you so much to the audience, to our guest. Come again, we've got some great programming coming up for the rest of the week, including a special program in honor of Juneteenth with many, many authors giving very personal reflections, thoughtful reflections about what Juneteenth as now a national holiday is. So come for that on Sunday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Rewatch this, tell your friends about this wonderful conversation. Thanks again, Caleb and Adam, and to our audience.